Welcome to this explainer. You know, when we picture ancient Rome, we usually conjure up this grand illusion of total invincibility. We picture gleaming marble temples, unstoppable legions, and emperors commanding the known world. But beneath that polished surface lay a really profound vulnerability. Rome wasn't some self-sustaining utopia. It was a hungry, incredibly fragile metropolis that relied on a highly organized, gritty secret weapon just to survive. Today, we are looking at Ostia Antica, the ancient port city that served as the absolute lifeline of the Roman Empire.
So, let's dive right into this massive logistical puzzle. How exactly did a city of over 1 million people survive when it couldn't even produce its own food? Rome's sheer urban scale meant its political stability depended entirely on safe, consistent maritime shipping from fertile foreign provinces like Egypt, Sicily, and North Africa. If this supply chain broke down, the capital faced immediate, violent urban rioting. It was literally a matter of life and death.
Section 1. The Lifeline of Rome, solving the geographical bottleneck. To prevent mass starvation, Rome ran a highly controlled, state-sponsored grain dole called the Cura and Annonae, but they faced a massive physical bottleneck. On one side, you have these gigantic, heavy Mediterranean grain freighters arriving from places like Alexandria or Carthage, and on the other side, you have the Tiber River leading up to Rome, which was notoriously shallow and winding. It's like trying to parallel park a semi-truck in a narrow alleyway. Those giant ships physically could not navigate up the river to the capital. They were forced to drop anchor exactly where the Tiber emptied into the sea, which was at Ostia.
So what was the fix for this geographical nightmare? Ostia became the mandatory transfer point. All that immense cargo was unloaded from the giant sea freighters onto specialized shallow draft river barges called quodiciere. And here's the truly crazy part. Once loaded, these barges were literally hauled upstream to Rome's urban docks by teams of oxen walking along the riverbanks. Ostia was the absolutely crucial middleman that made this entire operation possible.
Because of this continuous massive transfer of goods, Ostia just exploded in size. At its peak in the 2nd century AD, this wasn't just some quiet, sleepy harbor town, it was a bustling, multicultural metropolis of over 50,000 citizens. That is an absolutely astronomical number for a port city in the ancient world. It was bursting with wealthy merchants, highly organized trade guilds, and transient workers from literally every corner of the empire.
Section 2. Inside the concrete jungle, the reality of working-class Rome.
Let's put ourselves in their shoes and walk through the fast-paced dawn routine of a working-class Ostian. First, you'd wake up in an insula, which was a multi-story brick and concrete apartment block. These spaces were stacked, cramped, and super drafty. Since the upper floors completely lacked plumbing or private kitchens, which, actually, were terrifying fire hazards, by the way, Step 2 meant descending steep, dark stairs to haul your own water from public street fountains. And for breakfast, no cozy home cooking. You'd head right out into the noisy cobblestone streets to buy coarse wheat bread dipped in watered-down wine from a local street stall.
By the second hour after sunrise, the city was absolutely deafening. You had shouting dockworkers, known as saccarii, frantically unloading massive ships. The air was thick with the sound of creaking wooden cranes hoisting heavy terracotta jars filled with olive oil, Spanish wine, and garum, which was essentially a highly pungent, fermented fish gut sauce the Romans put on literally everything. Iron-rimmed carts dragged cargo constantly along the main highway, the Decumanus Maximus. All of this was destined for the Horea, massive, heavily fortified warehouse complexes designed with raised floors and thick stone walls to protect the empire's most volatile commodity, its food.
Section 3. Labor, Leisure, and Gods, the social fabric of the port. You can really see how divided yet totally interconnected the city was across its different social groups. Elite merchants lived in richly frescoed homes or the luxury lower floors of apartments, enjoying private banquets. Meanwhile, the working class occupied the middle floors of those brick Insulae complexes, spending their free time hanging out at their guild headquarters or the public baths. And then you had the transient sailors and dockworkers living in the cheapest upper floor garrets, spending their evenings gambling, drinking, and participating in maritime religious cults.
Since cooking at home was basically impossible for the working poor, the Thermopolium was essentially their dining room. Think of these as ancient fast food joints. Customers gathered around these distinct L-shaped marble counters that had inset jars keeping stews, lentils, and wines warm. People sat on benches, ate hot pork skewers, drank cheap spiced wine, and just unwound. It was the absolute center of working-class nightlife.
And you know, these daily routines built a seriously vibrant community. The sprawling baths of Neptune weren't just for hygiene. They were essential hubs for networking, political gossip, and striking business deals. Business itself was organized at the Piazzale delle Corporazioni, a grand square acting like a corporate headquarters for over 60 trade guild offices from across the Mediterranean. Workers belonged to collegia, which were powerful professional unions that protected their trades. And spiritually, Ostia was incredibly diverse. Traditional Roman temples stood right alongside underground Mithraea for the Persian god Mithras, shrines to the Egyptian goddess Isis, and even a prominent local synagogue.
Section 4. The Engine of Empire, Taxing the Mediterranean. Okay, everything, and I mean everything, hinged on this specific number, 2.5%. This was the portarium, a strict import customs tax. Nearly every single luxury item, building material, and even the wild animals bound for the Colosseum had to clear customs right here. Ostia housed a vast staff of imperial clerks and accountants who meticulously logged cargo and collected this tax, pouring millions of sesterces directly into the imperial treasury. It was literally the fiscal engine that funded Rome's grandeur.
Section 5. Pivotal Tides of History. The Rise, Fall, and Legacy of Ostia.
So, this brings up a huge question. What actually happens if this critical, state-run supply chain just completely collapses? Rome found out the hard way, and it changed the course of their government forever.
In 68 BC, highly organized fleets of Cilician pirates pulled off a daring raid, sailing right into Ostia's harbor. They torched Rome's war fleet, looted the markets, and even kidnapped 2 senators. The result was absolutely terrifying. A severe famine immediately threatened the capital. Driven by sheer public panic, the Senate passed the Lex Gabinia the following year. This was a highly controversial law that granted Pompey the Great sweeping, absolute military authority over the entire Mediterranean. Sure, Pompey wiped out the pirates in 3 months, but it set a dangerous legal precedent for centralized executive power that ultimately paved the way for Julius Caesar and the end of the Roman Republic. All because Ostia was breached.
As the empire grew past 1 million people, Ostia ran into another crisis, and this time it was nature. The shallow Tiber constantly silted up, causing heavy ships to run aground. To solve this, imperial engineers under Emperors Claudius and Trajan shifted heavy shipping slightly north to modern-day Fiumicino, creating what they called Portus. They built the sprawling Claudian basin and the perfectly enclosed Trajanic hexagon. But here's the really interesting part. Even though the massive ships unloaded at these new deepwater basins, Ostia completely retained its corporate and administrative dominance over the logistics network. It was still the ultimate boss of the supply chain. Fast forward a few centuries. Ostia's role as this huge international crossroads made it a natural entry point for early Christianity. In 387 AD, St. Augustine and his mother, St. Monica, stayed at an Ostian villa waiting for a ship back to Africa. Looking out a window facing a garden, they shared a profound mystical conversation about the nature of eternal life. Just days later, Monica contracted a fever and passed away there, permanently anchoring Ostia as a highly revered pilgrimage site in early Christian history. Jumping ahead to the 9th century, classical Ostia was actually largely abandoned by this point because of severe malaria outbreaks, but its strategic coastline was still Rome's primary shield. In 849 AD, a massive armada of Saracen ships set sail to sack Rome. Pope Leo IV formed a Christian alliance fleet that ambushed the invaders right off the coast of Ostia. Right in the middle of the battle, an incredibly violent storm, which many saw as divine intervention, smashed the Saracen ships against Ostia's abandoned cliffs. This epic naval clash completely ended the threat of a major invasion of Rome.
And that brings us to Ostia's incredible modern legacy. Because it was completely abandoned due to those tragic malaria outbreaks, it was naturally buried and perfectly preserved by layers of river silt. Unlike the city of Rome, which was continuously built over and demolished for thousands of years, Ostia remained completely untouched. It's basically a giant time capsule. It offers archaeologists and us the ultimate, unaltered window into the daily, working-class life of the Roman Empire.
Ostia Antica really proves that even the greatest empires in human history were entirely dependent on the fragile, highly organized logistics of everyday port workers, grain barges, and warehouses. Which leaves us with one final, provocative thought to ponder. If our modern global supply chains stopped tomorrow, how long would our own cities survive? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the systems that keep our world moving.